Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. She Poisoned Me by L.L. Morris. My parents got married while still in high school. I wouldn't recommend this. They got married in the 12th grade, to be exact. They were legal adults, and I came just a year later when my mom was 19 and my dad was 20. We lived in a one-bedroom upstairs apartment in a crappy complex. I slept in my crib until I started climbing out of it and finding my way into my parents' bed or into trouble. When I was 4, my parents decided I needed my own room, so they upgraded to a 2-bedroom downstairs apartment in the same complex. They fought a lot all the time, but outside of that, everything was pretty normal. I made a few friends with the other children around the complex, and a cousin and her 3 kids also lived in the complex. Everything was fine until a new neighbor moved in next door when I was 6. Immediately, this lady didn't like me, and she didn't hide it. I was at school when she moved in, but on the weekends when I went out to ride my big wheel bike and play, she stood in her door and glared at me with the most hateful look a person could give a child. To be honest, I didn't like her either. Something about her bothered my spirit greatly, though at the time I didn't understand why. It's like she could sense my presence outside and would literally spawn outdoors just to glare daggers at me and mutter things under her breath. I felt an evil presence on her, started making a cross with my fingers whenever I saw her. This enraged her, and she lied and told my mom that I threw her a middle finger. My mom believed me instead. Strange things started happening in my room at night. I had a rocking horse. It was beautiful, and I enjoyed playing with it. However, it started rocking on its own whenever I tried to sleep. My parents heard this as the springs made a distinctive noise. I also had one of those dolls that had eyes open and closed depending on if it was lying down or sitting up. The doll's eyes would sometimes remain open while lying down, or it would blink, scaring the crap out of me. There would be strange knocking noises in my wall, and my parents heard this as well, and they permitted me to sleep with them in bed. One day, my mom and I got locked out of our apartment, and this was before everyone had cell phones in the 90s, and our cousin wasn't home. My mom, against my pleas, knocked on the neighbor's door to use her phone. She let us in, glaring at me the entire time, and I never let go of my mom's hand or came from behind her leg. In this woman's house, on her walls were multiple upside-down crosses, strange-looking masks, some with horns. There were candles everywhere and some colorful bottles with powder in them. My mom looked around like, what the fuck, but kept her composure. She held my hand tighter, made the phone call to my dad at his job to hurry back, and we quickly exited the apartment after thanking the woman. She watched me as we left, and my mom told my dad everything, and he told his father, my grandfather, who was a pastor. He immediately brought us a bottle of olive oil, holy oil, to anoint our house. My mom also told her side of the family, who were very strict Christians, and they were, for a lack of a better word, flabbergasted, and they started a prayer meeting. A few days later, we noticed at our back door a white powder substance across the threshold. My mom poured some of the oil on it, and it absorbed it and it disappeared. The woman next door later tried to offer me some candy, which I declined, even though I loved sweets. My nickname was Sugar Ant because I loved junk so much. I had made friends with a little girl in the complex that lived on the other side, and one day she had some soft shoes and offered me one. Like an idiot, I accepted and ate it. It didn't take long before I fell violently ill. Fever, sweating, skin dark, and dark circles around the eyes. Nothing given to me at the doctor's helped. couldn't keep anything down. On intuition, my mom asked if I did accept and eat anything from anyone, and I confessed to accepting candy from a friend. She asked around and found out the girl was the granddaughter of our next-door neighbor. My dad called my grandfather and my mom and her family over. They anointed me with holy oil and made a prayer circle around me and started speaking in tongues. I was in and out of consciousness. My grandfather lifted me up and made me drink some of the oil, and I remember it burning my throat, and suddenly I had to throw up. I leapt from the couch where I was lying and sprinted to the bathroom where I had started throwing up a thick black sludge, and a lot came out. My mom was shaking and on the verge of tears. Everyone continued praying in tongues, and I threw up for a while until it was all out. I suddenly felt a lot better. I was fussed at for accepting food from strangers, even friends. The adults talked while I rested. After a few days, the woman saw that I was fine. This time, I glared back at her as I was angry. I was young, but I understood she had tried to poison me for no reason. I made the cross sign again with my fingers, and she went back into her house and slammed her door. She moved out some time after that. Strange Sounds at the Canyon by Knots Luna. This happened in late August. This is not a creative writing exercise. This actually happened. My girlfriend and I went on a hike on Little Cottonwood Canyon in Utah on the Grit Mill Trail, which is very short. The trailhead is right next to the Mormon granite record vaults, which are both basically at the mouth of the canyon, very close to civilization. It was about 7 p.m. when we started, so the sun was still up, but sunset was about 2 hours away. Everything seemed normal, and we never felt strange or like we were being watched, even when the weird sounds started. About half an hour into the hike, we started hearing loud screeches. Some of them sounded like they could be a bobcat or mountain lion, or maybe both in a fight or something. But many of the sounds did not. Some seemed like maybe screeching tires, but I'll explain later why this wasn't it either. The sounds lasted for about half an hour, and we had 20 to 30 minutes on the trail after they stopped. The trail was only a small loop, less than 2 miles total, and stayed within 500 or 600 yards of the main road at all times, and often was in sight of it, and we were on an exposed hillside for the middle portion of the hike where we could hear bits of conversations from a parking lot because sound was carrying really well. This makes me think the screeches were coming from much further away than it seemed like. We had stopped for a bit at this open viewpoint to figure out what was making the sounds. It sounded like someone was doing donuts and then maybe squealing brakes, then back to potentially an animal, and then a different animal? A few of the sounds seemed like they were being played over a loudspeaker, but most didn't. While we were standing there, we overheard some people in the parking lot get out and ask some others if they knew what it was, and they said they thought it might be us up on the hillside. For us, it sounded like it was originating down by them, but clearly for them, it sounded like it was coming from up above. As I mentioned before, the true point of origin was probably very far from either of those locations. Also of note, this parking lot was the UTA Park and Ride lot, where people come in the winter to park at a safe point and get shuttled up further to ski. One of the people asking what was up was a UTA driver, who I imagine is a regular of that location. If he hadn't heard it before, I think that lends credibility to it not being a regularly occurring sound. The sounds were usually very loud. They were audible way above the traffic and wind noise for the most part, and I've been on plenty of hikes and have heard various animals all over, but haven't heard this screeching sound before. I've also never heard cars making these sounds in any way. As it so happens, being a field recordist, I had already brought one of my microphones and was trying to grab some wind while we were up there. Without much success. We were so close to the road that noise from the cars through the entrance to the canyon passing pretty much got in the way of any quality recordings. I figured that might happen, but I bring at least one mic with me everywhere I go because I'm a dork. I did record a few minutes of these screams just to try and grab some, regardless of quality. There's road noise and loud wind that I couldn't really do much about, but several of the strange sounds are clearly audible in there. Uncle Josh note, I'm going to add those recording sounds right now.
Stones, whatever it is.
I'm not convinced it's one thing or another, and despite regularly looking into this for the past month, I'm still baffled. There are a few more things to note that I believe are important. 1. We were on the trail for a total of about an hour and a half. As mentioned, these sounds started half an hour in, lasted half an hour, and then we had 20 or 30 minutes left on the hike after they'd stopped. 2. There was constant road noise with very few breaks. Cars were passing and very audible essentially the entirety of the hike. Despite heavy foliage for the most part, we could regularly see cars passing at many points throughout. 3, and I hope this doesn't come across as facetious, but I have been an audio nut, a sound designer, a composer, etc., for over 12 years, and this is actually kind of important. My ears are very trained at this point. I bet anything that I could identify the difference in any two sounds, no matter how similar they are, even if I'd neither heard them before. I'm very good at identifying the makeup of sound. 4. Of those 12 years, 10 have been as a field recordist as well. I've spent countless days in nature for the specific purpose of recording the sounds the natural world has to offer. I have never heard anything even remotely like this before. I've even had several strange experiences over time and haven't heard anything similar. 5. I've received comments from all over the place, YouTube, Facebook, etc. There have been a lot of suggestions. Mountain lion, moose, elk, sandhill crane, various car sounds, wind, nothing at all. Bigfoot, wild man, skinwalker, teenagers making noises, and even the very nearby Mormon granite record vaults. I still can't make heads or tails of this. 6. I'm not trying to reach a particular conclusion here, but I want to eliminate the obvious. The reason I mention my experience in audio and all the details about the cars and such is, if it were cars, why did the sounds start and stop within the time frame of our hike, while cars were passing nearly constantly? There were several instances of sounds happening both with and without cars audibly passing. The same with wind. Wind was blowing heavily through the canyon with very few pauses. And also, I've recorded countless hours of wind in so many different situations that I'd probably have to hang up the microphones and call myself a lost cause if I heard all this and confused it with wind. The variations of the sounds are such that I don't think a single mechanical source is responsible. Despite those variations, the sounds all share sonic characteristics. I strongly believe that they came from the same source. I've listened to tons of sounds of the suggested animals. The first audible screech in the recording sounds similar to that of a mountain lion, but not close enough to where I believe that's actually it. The other sounds are much different than anything I believe a mountain lion could make, and I haven't found any recordings of them that line up at all. Every other suggested animal is not even close, I'm sorry to say. Moose sound nothing like this. Neither do elk. Every bird that was suggested couldn't be it, I don't think. They're all just too different, even in the various sounds those animals can make. If a human could make these sounds, even on a megaphone or something, I'd be very impressed. Someone did make a comment that they'd heard sounds like this at this exact location in 2015 and smelled an awful smell and had a feeling of dread. And they got the fuck out of there and then saw a pair of eyes once they got back to their car. They were too high up to be anything but something standing on its hind legs or similar. Considering that so far this is the only person to let me know that they'd heard these sounds before, especially in the same area, I'm inclined to believe that whatever they say is more likely to be the source than anything else. Please feel free to comment. I promise I'm not trying to roast the suggestions I've gotten so far. I just don't think they line up. As I said before, I'm not trying to reach any particular conclusion. Thanks for listening. Would love to know your thoughts, and if anyone else has heard this before. Stalker in Community College by Brissa Lena. This happened like 6 or 7 years ago. I played soccer for 1 year in community college after high school. I knew this guy because he worked for the athletics department, and he was another student. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I had a 1-hour gap between classes. This guy noticed me in the library, asked what I was doing there, and I told him I had an hour-long gap, and he started coming regularly to hang out. I didn't mind because he seemed like a normal guy. He wasn't waiting for anything, but he just wanted to hang out. He brought me little gifts a few times, like chocolate and stuff, but he was being a little too sweet for someone that he barely knew, and I wasn't thinking about red flags. With the gifts, I remember he always downplayed it. He'd be like, "They had extra Kit Kat bars today in the office. Do you want some?" He never said that he purposefully bought a Kit Kat for me. I know a lot more about boys now than I knew back then. I think he knew that buying me gifts would be too much, but he still wanted to do it without doing it. The soccer season ended for us before Thanksgiving. The only teams that kept playing after that were going to the playoffs, not us. After Thanksgiving, we had finals. In that brief period after the soccer season and before Thanksgiving, this guy asked me about my classes for second semester. To be honest, I hadn't been super organized with course registration, and I honestly didn't know. And also, the counselors were completely clueless. I didn't tell him that, but I remember saying that I didn't want to have another gap hour like this because it wasted so much time. And I don't think he was happy to hear that. He also asked me if I was going to play another season, and I said no. I needed to manage my time better, and playing soccer every day was not helping. I think my mistake was that I just said too much and unfiltered everything. I used to do that a lot back then, saying too much without thinking about how it could affect other people's feelings. When I told him all this, that was the last Thursday before Thanksgiving. So, no more hour gaps to hang out anymore. We had Thanksgiving break, We took our finals, and we had winter break. Everything was great. Winter break was when the real problem started. In the mornings, this guy literally showed up outside my house while sitting in his car. The first time I didn't believe it was actually him. The second time, I checked and it was. By then it was really clear that we both knew what was going on. He was stalking me. And that wasn't all. I posted on my Instagram stories sometimes about places I was. This guy literally showed up there several times, like girly stores at the mall where he had zero business being. He did lots of things like that. He also started pointing his phone at me like he was taking pictures, and that was even weirder. I basically stopped using social media over this. After winter break, this continued. When my parents were at work, this guy came during the afternoon too. I called the cops a few times, and they went and tried to talk to him. He basically told them that he wasn't going to talk, and that was it. I think the cops wanted to help, but they could never do anything about it because he was careful not to break any laws. Like he didn't trespass, and he didn't make threats, and he didn't show weapons, etc. I have no idea what he's doing now. My guess is that he gave up. Maybe his little obsession kind of became old and he found other things to pay more attention to. At least I hope so. But if he still comes by, I have no idea. I think the most challenging thing is that I couldn't tell my parents, since I knew that all of this would have completely freaked them out. Creeps me out every time I think of it, by I'm Not the Droid You're Looking For. A few years ago, in the fall or early winter of 2019, we were staying with my husband's father. We rented and moved into a house a couple of months later, but had been staying there less than a week at the time this happened. I slept in the living room on an air mattress with our kids, ages 10, 5, and 1. The kitchen, dining room, and living room were all open space. There was a wide counter and sink that was a bar on the living room side. He had never had stools or used it like that, though. He'd always had a sofa pushed right up to it, and had storage for dishes and whatever in the kitchen side. On each end of that counter, there was about 4 or 5 feet of open space between it and the wall. Along the wall directly opposite the front door were 3 doors. From left to right, my father-in-law's bedroom, a bathroom, and a spare room. My husband slept in the tiny spare bed. His dad kept the door to his room closed and usually had a TV and, depending on the weather, either a space heater or window AC unit, or at least one fan going. I don't remember if my husband had the door to the room he was sleeping in open or closed that night. Except for that back wall where the bedrooms and bathroom were, the house had windows all the way around it. Large floor-to-ceiling windows along the front and a line of large sliding windows along each side wall. It was originally built as a sort of camp getaway cabin, so windows equaled view. Apparently, my father-in-law disagreed and was in the process of building a front porch and replacing about half of those windows with a wall. However, at the time, the porch was still being built and none of the windows had been changed or taken out yet. On this particular night, I was holding my 18-month-old with a child on each side of us. We had all been asleep for a while when I woke up. I'm not sure what time it was, but the house was mostly quiet and no one else was awake. I laid there quietly without moving around for a little while and couldn't figure out why I was awake at all, much less so alert. Not long after, I decided it was just one of those things, sleep cycles, blah, 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 and was about to try to go back to sleep when someone knocked on the front door. Not a loud banging, beating knock, but definitely a knock. The air mattress was in the middle of the living room area, and the door was on the kitchen side of the dividing counter. I really didn't want to answer the door for multiple reasons. I was in the middle of 3 sleeping children. It was late, it was cold, and we were cozy and warm all snuggled together. Plus, it wasn't my house, and no one else seemed to notice someone was knocking. The knocking went on for longer than I would have knocked on someone's door in the middle of the night, and it did get more persistent, though never did turn into banging. No one called out for somebody to answer the door, and no one's cell phone rang. Finally, I heard someone walking down the unfinished porch. They had stacked some boards and tools and stuff against the house, and I heard no clatters or thumps or anything like that. But it did sound like whoever was out there was having to walk on and around those building materials. And then I heard a distinct and firm tapping on the window closest to the kids and me. There was a small, older TV and a small stereo with speakers sitting on 2 small tables, about nightstand size actually. The one holding the TV was an old nightstand I had given him years before. That was between the air mattress and the windows. I was facing away from the window, but the tapping was right there where our heads were. An entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, and the tapping was done only in the area that would have been in my direct line of sight if I hadn't been facing the other direction. I don't think I took a single breath until it stopped, and I heard footsteps walking away, and they walked across the porch, all the way to the end of it, where the driveway was. Down there were sheets of tin, and walking across those made a pretty distinct sound. I know exactly what it sounds like when someone walks on tin. What I did not realize until the next morning was that the only sheets of tin out there were already in place, because they had finished putting it up as a roof over the porch before stopping for the evening, which meant that there were no sheets of tin stored against the wall or under the windows with those boards and tools and whatever else was out there. The only way for someone or something to have walked across those sheets of tin, I am certain beyond the shadow of a doubt that I heard happening after hearing an unknown someone knock and tap for so long, it became unsettling rather than annoying, would have been for them to jump or swing up onto the top of the house and porch from an incomplete porch floor and then jump back down at the end. It scares me in a way nothing else ever has, and still does every single time I accidentally think about it. The Man in White by Rev Eddie. In late fall of 2011, I was inside an AutoZone in the small town of Anthony, Texas. I was looking for a pair of license plate light bulbs for my 2004 salvage title Hyundai Tiburon. My father had given it to me as a high school graduation gift years prior. While in the store, I ran into my friend Cheeto, who I hadn't seen since our graduation. We had a brief talk, and he asked me what I'd been up to. I told him I'd just quit working at the county jail as a detention officer after being there for only a year, and that I was looking to start my own mobile car detailing business, but needed to come up with some cash to get that rolling. Cheeto and I grew up in the same town, but went to different elementary schools. We both liked baseball, and I remember playing against his Little League team when we were kids. It wasn't until middle school that we met and started to hang out all the way through high school. Cheeto knew that I liked to work because one day he asked our whole high school hangout crew, which was about 18 of us, if anyone wanted to work over the upcoming winter break. He would get us work in a local pecan farm and his uncle managed at the time. A few days later, Cheeto and I were the only ones out of the bunch on our knees picking up pecans at 6 a.m., surrounded by about 10 or so undocumented immigrants who were filling up their 5-gallon buckets at least 4 times faster than we ever could. That day at AutoZone, after hearing about my current situation, Cheeto asked me if I would be interested in going to work with him in the oil fields in the West Texas towns of Midland and Odessa. He said it was hard labor, but the money was good. We exchanged phone numbers, and I went home to tell my parents about it. I was 21 at the time and was still living with my parents. I also had no plans for my future. I had gone to a technical school for a semester a year prior and called it quits after realizing HVAC was not what I wanted to do. And I had already tried to pursue my dream of becoming a musician and realized pretty early on that that industry, even at a local level, is full of leeches, and I would be fighting an uphill battle with an undefined outcome. That same evening, I loaded up my Tiburon and headed east on I-10 and subsequently I-20 to the town of Midland, Texas. Cheeto was staying in an old 20-foot travel trailer and said I could stay with him and sleep on the couch for a few days while I went through the hiring process and then got situated somewhere else. He sent me the address, and I arrived around 10:30 p.m. that night to a snoring, tired high school friend of mine in an old camper with the stove burner on, heating up an empty Como, which was doing a decent job trying to keep the small trailer warm. The next morning, I woke up alone in the trailer. Cheeto had left at 4 a.m. to work, and at around 6 a.m. I got a welcoming text from him, and he told me to settle in and feel free to grab anything from the fridge or small pantry if I got hungry. He said he had talked to his boss, and he wanted me to go to the yard for an interview at 1 p.m. that day to see if they could fill in a newly opened spot. I arrived early and was received by a gentleman named Rick, who told me the big boss was at a funeral, and he would be giving me the interview. The interview was short and to the point, and I was hired that day. I later found out the funeral was for a kid who worked for the company and died in a car accident days before while driving home after an 18-hour shift. I got hired to fill his spot. Cheeto was right. It was hard labor, but the money was good. A couple of weeks went by, and I eventually moved out to a newer and nicer trailer that was being rented out on the west side of Odessa. At work, we didn't have a set schedule. We would go in very early and get out late pretty much every day. Our days off would come randomly and with short notice. And this story happened to me on one of those off days. I woke up late that morning and chilled in the camper until around noon, and then went to get a haircut. I then went to the mall and walked around a while before going to Walmart for a few groceries. I went back to the trailer to drop off the groceries, took a shower, and then decided to go to the gym. While at the gym, I got a text from a coworker, and he invited a few other coworkers out for a few beers, to which we all accepted. I finished my workout and drove back to the camper. The trailer was parked inside the property of a nice middle-aged couple who lived there with their dog Sam, a few free-roaming chickens, and some sheep they kept corralled somewhere behind the house. Their lot was square, around 4 acres, and I would guess their house was right in the middle. The trailer I was renting was out on the northeast side of that lot, along their chain-link fence, and there was a 10 by 20 covered shed about 20 yards next to the trailer, also along the fence. I would park my car outside of the fence and would have to go through a gate which had a lock on it, and then walk about 30 yards to the trailer. I arrived from the gym and parked my car where I normally did and got out. The sun had set about 10 minutes prior, and it was starting to get dark outside. As I walked to the gate, I noticed the repetitive echoing sound of what seemed to be a young sheep in distress coming from the back of the house. It was the first time I heard it, but I didn't think much of it. As I worked on opening the gate lock, Sam, the dog, came over to greet me like he normally did and rubbed against my legs as I went through the gate and put the lock back on. I then turned around to walk towards the trailer and noticed the dog looked up and stopped. I myself stopped and looked up and saw the solid white silhouette of a tall man leaning his shoulder against the north side wall of the house. The man had no face, but seemed to be facing us. I immediately felt blood rushing to my head like I was about to faint, but managed to stay conscious. The dog kept trying to bark, but couldn't out of fear. The silhouette stood up straight and started walking away from the wall sideways, crossing one leg in front of the other towards the shed. It faced us the whole time. It was the funniest walk ever. It almost looked like a bad animation. I couldn't believe what we were seeing. The man kept walking in the same manner and eventually made it inside the shed. I took a second to gather myself and continued walking towards the trailer, looking directly at the shed the whole way. I got inside the trailer and jumped in the shower, scared the whole time. I got ready to go out and waited for my coworkers to pick me up. A few minutes later, I received a text letting me know they were parked outside the gate waiting for me. I walked out of the trailer again, looking towards the shed, but didn't see the man. I got in the truck and told my coworkers about it, and their reaction was pretty lackluster, and they all seemed pretty incredulous. But I was still in shock. I had just seen a ghost. A real ghost. To this day, I still don't have an explanation for what Sam and I saw that night. It was scary when it happened, but I never got a sense of malice from this entity. It was just there, and then it was gone. I stayed in the trailer for a few more months after this happened, and never saw the man again. I thought about telling the landlords, but never did. At the end of 2014, the oil industry went through a slump, and work slowed down quite a bit for us. Cheeto and I ended up quitting our jobs on the same day after sitting at home for a few days without work, and ended up going back to our hometown of Anthony, Texas. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Don't forget, we're getting closer to October, and that means our annual Halloween extravaganza. If you have a scary story involving Halloween, make sure you send it in. I'd love to have it be a part of things. Follow me on social media, you know how to figure that out. And if you'd like to support the channel, find my Patreon page or consider buying some merchandise from my storefront at tpublic.com. There's a link to that in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.